This is our second class in Exposition of Genesis, and we are picking up with the actual study of the text this morning. And the 50 chapters in Genesis follow two main headings, and this is an outline you must memorize. Okay, the first division is the beginnings of the human race, or primeval history. Yeah. Don't bother jotting it down because I have your notes coming. But I just want you to follow it mentally. All right. The first division covers the first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis, and it's primeval history, or you could call it the beginnings of the human race. And there are four main events recorded in these 11 chapters. The first one is creation. The second one is the fall of man. The third one is the flood. And the fourth one is the episode of the Tower of Babel. Now, these four events are intimately connected to each other. Creation, the first two chapters in the book, shows us the origin of the whole entire universe. The fall of man episode, recorded in chapters 3 through 5, records for us the origins of all the problems in the human race. Sin and the broken human relationships, the spiritual warfare between men and spirit beings under Satan's control, the entire physical curse that touches everything in the universe, and so forth. Okay? All the problems in the universe are traced to the second major event recorded in chapters 3 through 5. Chapters 6 through 8, which we call the flood, is important because the original creation was destroyed, and we do not live in a world that even materially is like the original creation. And so in order to explain the world in which we live, the physical, geological world in which we live, and this planet, not necessarily the other planets, but in this planet, we see a world that is only explained through the flood. Okay, so the flood is crucial to understanding this planet in which we live, the physical makeup of it. And especially so since science as we know it is based on a post-flood world. Everything that science is uncovering in geology and paleontology and archaeology, in physics and chemistry and biology and all these sciences, everything that science presently is finding is in a post-flood context, right? And tremendous implications about the nature of the creation, the created world, are found when you carefully study the flood and read what it says God did to this planet in the flood. So it's a crucial study. Okay, and Christians who do not believe, number one, in creationism, and number two, in the Noahic cataclysm, as the Bible says it, are Christians that are messed up in their thinking and will not interpret the Bible correctly. You can't be a theistic evolutionist. You can't deny that there was an original worldwide flood and make any sense out of our world, nor the Bible for that matter. Okay.
Actually, the creation, the Genesis is a very good role to understanding New Testament or salvation.
That's right. Not only because of the seed ideas, the basic themes, but because Jesus himself made numerous references to these 11 chapters in Genesis and used events in Noah's day as a parallel to the days of the coming of Christ and so forth. And the last event in these 11 chapters, first 11 chapters, is the Tower of Babel, which is absolutely essential for us to understand because it gives to us the beginning of languages, and the beginning of languages is essential to the beginning of culture, and language and culture are essential to the beginning of people groups or nations. You see? they logically relate to each other. And so even to understand history, you have to understand Babel. You see. And modern history and modern archaeology are, as we said yesterday, simply corroborating the declarations of Scripture, in their findings. There's never been a historical find yet that has, without false assumptions, without false assumptions, ever controverted a declaration of Scripture. There are people saying, "Oh yes, we have found skulls that are 4.3 billion years of age, in the old Dubai Gorge in Africa." Mary Leakey, Lewis Leakey, and Richard Leakey, evolutionary scientists, have made such claims, but they're working on unbiblical assumptions. Okay, we don't agree with that. In fact, as we go through these 2 chapters in Genesis today, the one thing I want you to see is that the record of creation, as we are given, is perfectly logical, even if it is miraculous. It's perfectly logical. There's logic there, just absolute logic all the way through. So let's do it. Okay? Let's look this morning at the 2 accounts of creation that we have in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Before I go any further, I have to acknowledge that I'm going to be giving you one particular interpretation, and I want you to realize the perspective on which I'm coming and the assumptions on which our interpretation is based. There are other interpretations. The other interpretations include theistic evolutionism, which is an interpretation of these 2 chapters, which essentially takes the first verse as literal. Many Christians take the first verse in the Bible as literal and believe that, yes, God originally made all the building blocks of the universe. In eternity past, He created them. But then theistic evolution is a theory that attempts to wed the biblical record with evolutionary dogma and theory. And so it tries to fit evolution into the creation account. So they take the first verse literally, but then everything else is taken non-literally. When it says that the evening and the morning were the first day, they don't take that as a 24-hour day. They take that as an undefined period, perhaps of 5 million years, or 50 million years. You see, and all these 7 days that the creation account allegedly refers to are not 24-hour days, but in fact a reference to the uncounted eons of time that are necessary for uniformitarian evolutionary theory, so that man could have evolved from the original soup that God made in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Okay? Now, I reject that theory for a number of reasons. I'm not going to take time to go.
Question is the Namos, big elephant, Asian elephant.
Right.
It was found in the ice of Siberia.
Right.
So just hold the elephant. But his date is far over the 6,000 from now.
Right.
And for some person who found it in the Alpes mountain, it's far from 6,000 period.
Right.
But if we date it like this, it's just 6,125 maximum.
Did you say 6,000?
Yeah, 6,000 from now.
Right.
About 6,000.
Right.
But the body found is more than over 6,000, and the elephant doesn't.
I just read that, and I thought that they placed it more recent than that.
Yeah, just the couple of years.
Yeah, there's been a couple of them. There was one, a man found in Switzerland, right? Or Austria, up in the...
Ice.
Yeah.
It is far from 6,000, longer than 6,000.
Oh, I didn't think it was that far back.
Oh, I at that time I think about when I read it.
Yeah.
And also the Mammoth
Right.
is also far from 6,000.
Right.
So the Mammoth is represented the proof of the flood. Because
Right.
how can Mammoth live in Siberia? Siberia,
Right.
near to the...
We're getting ahead of ourselves. But the question you're raising is the question of dating. You know, and this is why you need to watch a couple of creationist videos where these questions are answered, because I don't have the ability to answer some of these questions. All I know from the reading I've done is that creationist scientists challenge the dating methods used by people in science today, and they have written articles proving the inconsistency and the unreliability of carbon-14 dating, for example. You know, it's not an exact science. You know, so you can't take the claims of people who say that this particular individual that was discovered in the ice fields in Europe, you know, as being whatever. You know, I thought the date was something around 6,000 years ago, but if you say it's longer than that, what they're doing is they're basing it on carbon-14 dating. Okay. Carbon-14 dating has been shown to be plus or minus, you know, 5 or 10,000 years at any given date that they find. You know.
And Chinese history, they over 5,000 recorded.
Yeah, yeah.
Then more than over 5,000 history recorded.
Right.
Like book. Then the flood is studied after 100,600.
Right.
The 16, more than 1,600.
Right.
Then the Chinese record about history is before.
Right.
Before the flood. Just keep going.
Right.
So
it's difficult to explain how that fits together.
I just is like
What I want you to do, in fact, I would like all of you to do this, is to keep one sheet of paper in this course and write down your hard questions. Because I don't know if I can answer them all, but I would like a list of your questions so that I can work on them myself. Okay, so like I can't answer that particular one there about how, you know, secular history, you know, takes Egypt back prior to the flood. No, I don't understand that. No. It's a good question, but I can't answer them all. What I would like to do is make some progress in chapters 1 and 2. Okay? What we have in chapters 1 and 2, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked here in this question. I was trying to explain for you a couple of alternative theories. The one theory is theistic evolution, right? I've explained that. Another theory is that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are recording for us two creations. The original creation is in chapter 1, verse 1, where it says God created the heaven and the earth. And then there are a couple of variations of creationist interpretation that suggest that either Satan fell or that there was an original human population on earth that God destroyed. And so starting in chapter 1 verse 2 and going to the end of chapter 2, he's describing a second creation or a recreation. This is a very common view. Okay? That these chapters are actually describing two creations, the original creation in 1:1 and then a recreation in the rest of the chapter. Okay? And the reason people hold to this, again, is because if there was an original creation in 1:1 and 1:3 and following is describing a recreation, there's a gap between 1:1 and 1:2, which then would allow possibly for uncounted ages between the original creation and the second and the recreation, which then again in some people's minds legitimizes evolutionary findings and is an attempt to harmonize the Bible with evolution. If you can stick 5 billion years between chapter 1:1 and 1:2, you know, then maybe evolution does fit with the Bible in people's thinking. Okay? Another argument for this is the language of chapter 1 verse 2, where it says the earth was without form and void and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Right? Now this is an interesting point because the same phrase without form and void is found in the book of Isaiah, exactly exactly the same Hebrew phrase in a context where God says, I'm going to destroy Israel, and destroy this world, and it's going to be without form and void. It's in a judgment context, and the same phrase is found. So people take that and they say, here it is, this is evidence that this is a divine judgment in 1:2. So it's obvious in their thinking that there was an original creation. For some reason, God destroyed his first creation, and they imply because of the satanic rebellion in heaven and the fall of the angels, you see. And then God started over with a recreation. Okay? Now, I reject that, okay, for reasons that I'll explain, when we get to the end of chapter 1, right? What I believe is that we have a single creation found in both of these chapters. And I think that in chapter 1 we have a general account of creation that takes us all the way through the 6 days. It's a chronological account that takes us systematically, point by point, what God did from the beginning to the end of the 6th day in chronological order. Okay? Whereas the second chapter describes for us more details, not necessarily in chronological order in that chapter, but more details that are meant to complement and show how God did the things that he did in chapter 1. That's very, very important for you to understand. I don't think we have two different creations, one in chapter 1 and a different one in chapter 2. All right? Nor do I think we have two creations in chapter 1, an original and a recreation. The interpretation I'm giving to you in this class is that both chapters describe the same creation. The first account is general and chronological. The second account is more specific and non-chronological, and it's meant to be complementary to the first account. All right?
Second creation is more focused on the Adam and Eve, particularly.
Right. Somebody told me, I mentioned this I think yesterday, I heard this for the first time, that this person believed that chapter 1, God created human beings, men, male and female. Didn't give them names. And then in chapter 2, there was a second creation where God actually made Adam and Eve, you see? And they viewed these as separate accounts. And I went through it with them and explained why I didn't think that was so. Let's get into it, because it's easier to address all your questions as we go verse by verse, and then we'll make some progress. Okay. One more thing. What I think was happening here in this situation is that chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, describe for us a situation where God made all the building blocks of the universe. It says, in the beginning God created the earth and the heaven and the earth. The way I see that, the reference to heaven there is not heaven as we know it, but God created space. Just space. And that the reference to the earth here is not this particular planet, but it's a reference to all matter. Matter. Just matter. Three-dimensional matter. Mass. Anything with mass. Okay?
The universes belong to the also mass.
Yes. All the planets out there came from this point right here. In the beginning, God created all matter, and matter cannot exist without space in which to exist. Right? So
maybe heaven is universe and earth is planet?
No, I don't think so, because, well, I'll explain it as we go through, okay? I just want you to get the overview here. Please understand what I'm saying. If you don't agree with it, well, that's your business, okay? But as I see it, and this is the way Henry Morris sees it as well, in the textbook, he thinks that this is a reference to God creating all the building blocks of the universe. He created the, what's the word he used for it? The electromagnetic forces of the universe. Magnetism is related to the nuclear makeup of every atom. It's just built right into it. And when you have two atoms, you also have other forces besides the nuclear forces, the electromagnetic. Then you have magnetic forces where bodies with mass attract to each other. that we call that gravitational forces. So there's a relationship between gravity and electromagnetism, but I think electromagnetism is related as well to nuclear forces that are inherent in every atom. Okay? If my understanding is correct, right? So what this verse is saying is that God created space, and then in space he created matter, which implies all of these forces. Nuclear forces built into the very protons and electrons within every atom, right? And then, you know, and those are invisible molecules, but they're molecules nevertheless. There is mass there. Even if we can't measure it, it's there. You put enough of those together and you have a human, like, not at that point there was a human body, but if you had a piece of planetary matter, it's composed of billions and billions and trillions of cells, not cells, molecules, you know, most of which are air or space, you know, because, you know, I'm having a hard time explaining this, but an atom is mostly space, you know. An atom is formed by the extent of the orbit of the electrons that circulate around a particular group of protons in the nucleus. Okay, you put enough of those together and you have something visible and something that has weight or mass. Okay, and so that's what God was doing. He was putting these things together, and this is a reference scientifically to the creation of nuclear forces, electromagnetic forces, and gravitational forces as a result of the existence of things in relationship to each other. Okay? Don't you remember in physics, I was in grade 11 when we did this experiment, replicated the experiment, famous experiment where you hang two balls of the same size and mass together from strings, you know, and then you take the one and you start it swinging in a pendulum-like motion, right, beside the other one. You know, they're very close to each other, just a centimeter apart. And eventually, the motion of this one ball, because it has mass, will begin the other ball to be attracted to it, right? And it will cause it to start swinging 90 degrees to it, right? Because it comes back and forth and it vibrates and it begins. This one is going this way and the other one is going 90 degrees to it, being attracted to it every time it comes down there. You see? You know, so that was the first scientific proof. You know, I don't know who did it. Some guy in Italy, you know, came up with that one. You know, and which proved this gravitational forces, and so that explains the tides on Earth and so forth. You know, that the moon, at a certain point in its orbit, or the Earth's orbit around the sun, comes in relationship to the moon in such a way that the moon sucks the water away towards itself off that side of the planet Earth, right? Which brings the water away from the shorelines, right? And then as the moon moves away from the Earth, or as the Earth moves away from the moon, then the water then is no longer held by the gravitational pull of the moon, and then it recedes back to its original place of rest. You see, and so then we call that the tide coming in. Okay, so without going into too much more detail, I think that 1:1 in Genesis is saying God created space, that's heaven, and the earth, which is a reference to all matter. Verse 2 describes the original chaotic condition of this creation.
God is a spirit. Spirit it doesn't limited by three-dimension scientific analysis.
Right.
So the spirit can go through in this
That's right.
material.
Right.
But the universe is basically three-dimension scientific, the order. So the four-dimension existence, he provided three-dimension in universe, universe and earth, heaven and earth. That kind of thing. Four-dimension, God, spirit.
Yeah.
He created three-dimension situation, the universe. So he
I can hardly comment on the fourth dimension because it's only an idea to me.
Just four dimension is spirit quality.
Yeah.
Spirit quality doesn't affect it by three dimension
That's
limitation.
Right.
But we we living in our body is limited by three-dimension world.
Right.
It's like a scientific or
Right.
atom, and so God created the world and the earth and heaven, universe and earth is all in the three-dimension scientific order. So
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, the God is a four-dimension situation, but the earth is three-dimension, so he can do that with higher position.
Right. Verse 2 describes, as I understand it, the nature of this original creation. When God started, he started with something. First he made space, right? First he made the heaven. This is the order in which it says. First he made the space in which to put the matter. It would be absurd to turn it around and make the matter first and then make space, because that would be impossible. Matter takes up space. Okay, so the biblical order is logical. First he made space, then he made matter. What was it like? The earth was without form and void. In other words, the matter was unformed, it was unfilled, it had not yet been ordered by the Creator. It was just left in as Henry Morris describes it, a soupy matrix. It was all mixed up. And yeah, well, it was just mixed up. You know, the gases and the matter and everything from which the planets and everything else came was at one time, it was just brought into existence. First he created the building blocks, okay, and then he formed and filled it, and that's what we see in the rest of creation. And so it says that he hadn't even created any light. The matter was there that eventually, as we see in the rest of day one, God was going to give to some of these planets light-emitting qualities. He was going to create the principle of light, but he hadn't yet formed the atoms and the matter into these light-emitting objects at this point. First he made space, then he made matter. It was all mixed up in a soupy, unformed, disordered, chaotic arrangement. And then it says at the end of verse 2, in this totally chaotic situation, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. God's invisible Spirit began then to energize in the midst of this watery, all mixed up situation. And the word "moved" there in the Hebrew is a very graphic word. It refers to the fluttering of the wings of a hen. To the fluttering of the wings of a hen as it sits over its brood. Okay? Not necessarily flying through the air, but just hovering. Okay? And if you think about that, that's a very graphic illustration of what is true of all energy. You know, electrical energy in our culture is defined by 60 hertz, or 60 cycles per second, right? Cycles being going from like a sinusoidal wave on an oscilloscope, you know, that's negative and positive, negative, positive, negative, positive. Okay? So 60 of those complete cycles every second is basic to electrical energy. But then we know that electricity is only one part of the energy spectrum. Light is also, you know, the different colors of light. You know, it is formed by different wavelengths and different vibrations with different characteristics. It's still vibration. Okay, long waves. You know, that's the difference between FM and AM. If I understand it, an FM wave is about 3 feet long, and an AM wave can be any short distance as it goes through this room in which we're sitting. Right? It's electrical. It's electrical energy. Light here is, you know, this white light is coming through at a certain frequency, right? But if you put an X-ray machine, then those light waves would be going through this room invisibly to us, because our eyes are not created with the ability to detect many kinds of energy. And so, you know, as much difficult as I have in explaining it, my understanding is that all forms of energy relate to vibration. Okay, even nuclear energy, there is the constant motion of nuclear particles moving within the proton of an atom, within the nucleus of an atom. Okay, there's this constant. I've seen pictures of it where they've devised instruments whereby they can actually get these subnuclear particles to show up on a screen, as they fly through, as they move within the atom, right? And so all energy is related to motion, to vibration of some form or another. And so when it says here in this verse that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water, or began to hover over the face of the water, it's telling us that God is the source of light. He's the source of all forms of energy. He is the energy source, and he started all the energy systems within the whole universe. He began all of them, through sympathetic motion, if you wish, or simply imparting them to the matter. If to use a crude example, we're sitting in this room. Okay, let's say this room was one huge aircraft simulator, that's sitting on top of what's the word I'm looking for? Springs and pulleys and hydraulic. Boy, my vocabulary is terrible today. Hydraulic. What do you call those things? I'm out of my element. That's why I'm having a hard time describing it. What do you call it? Hydraulic cylinders. Cylinders. All right. So if this room was sitting on top of hydraulic cylinders, we think it's an ordinary room, but the operator for the aircraft simulator could easily cause us to start swaying in this room by pressing a button and causing the hydraulic cylinders to start going like this, which makes the room go like this. We're in the room, and so therefore we go like this. You see? Now that's what I think happened in creation, that God, is the source of all energy, and so his Spirit invisibly imparted to all aspects of the creation all forms of energy, right, that relate to this vibration. And then the next thing, which is logical, God said, "Let there be light." In the process of imparting energy to the creation, then there is a visible part. This is a visible spectrum of energy. We call it light. But it's the visible part of the energy spectrum, but there is an invisible element of the energy spectrum on both ends of the visible spectrum, if you wish. Above and below. Okay? I think, isn't sound the part that's below light? And I think, X-rays and, other forms of energy, nuclear energy, are all above, right? We can't sense that, but we can only sense what is visible. You see? Right.
This book explain what you told?
Yes. Yeah. That's why I want you to get this one, because he explains what was happening scientifically. Okay.
But how explain the word, the base of the word? Is a real word?
Yeah, I think that, water, remember, has several states. It has a frozen state, right? It has a liquid state. It has a steam state, Okay, it doesn't tell us that it was necessarily in liquid state. Okay?
The real meaning word is different ice or...
Yeah, in all of its states. Okay? Just there. Okay? So within the original context, God made matter and space, okay, and it tells us that a degree of the original creation was in the form of water. It tells us, now whether that means literal water or whether it refers to a liquid form or whatever, of all the gases, whatever. Come on in.
Oh.
Grab a seat.
Hi.
How you doing, guys?
Yeah.
Sorry, we got called in. We would have been here in time.
Oh, is that right, eh?
Called into the board.
Oh, I see.
We lost Billy, so
No kidding, eh?
lost half of the acre truck.
We have only gotten through verse 2. Well, we didn't start till 10 o'clock. Yeah, yeah. Mandy, this is, I guess everybody's met. Chang, this is John
Yeah.
and Rick. This is Chang and Bob and Mandy. Right? All right, we're in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. I'll just give you a quick review. What we've been talking about is one of the theories, or one of the interpretations of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, is that both of these chapters refer to the same creation. We don't have two creations. Okay? Chapter 1 is a chronological general account. Chapter 2 is not necessarily a chronological account. The days are mixed up in the second account, but they are giving us additional details. And as I see it, the second chapter is giving us information that complements the first chapter. The first one is general and very logical and chronological, and the second one just gives us necessary details to understand the first one. Okay? We've already talked about the three different theories of creation, or three different basic interpretations of these chapters. The one that your mom and your brother were espousing is a two-creation model, right? That most of these chapters is describing a recreation, and that there was a first creation in chapter 1:1 where it says God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, so we're going to show some of the deficiencies of that interpretation as we go through, right? So I just want everybody to see where I was coming from here. I view this starting in 1:1 as the beginning of the only creation there is. Okay, and that on the beginning of day 1, God created first, he made space, heaven, and then he made earth, which is a reference to matter, all matter, within space. You can't have matter without space, so he had to make the space first, you see? And then verse 2 is describing the totally chaotic nature of this creation to this point. He just made it, and it was all floating around there, all mixed up, all the matter in all the space.
The matter is elements of chemical.
All the chemical elements, all the nuclear elements, all the physical elements, everything. Okay, everything. And then at the end of verse 2, in that chaotic situation, it says the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters, and we were just talking about that when you came in, that the Spirit of God moved, and the Hebrew word means fluttered. And when a bird flutters, its wings are vibrating. And so this is a graphic word that tells us that God, who is the source of all life and energy, himself imparted to all matter, to everything in his universe, all the various forms of energy. Whether you call it electrical energy, there's sinusoidal waves, that indicate to us the vibration nature of, here's an engineer, he could explain this better than me, but electrical energy has a negative positive vibration in all its forms. Light has a up-down vibration, in all its forms. In the spectrum of light that's invisible to the naked eye, there's still vibration. It's just a different frequency. In the spectrum of energy that's below the visible light spectrum, probably, I think that's sound, most of the sound, there's still that vibration. Every pitch is a different frequency, you see. There is, within nuclear energy, within every atom, there's still vibration, of all the subnuclear particles, within, it's vibration. Any way you look at it, any form of energy is vibration.
And any solid stuff also inside.
There's vibration going on inside that cup.
And it's stated that all molecular activity, which is this vibration you talk about, ceases at minus 460 degrees Kelvin Rankine.
I
The
see.
absolute scale.
Okay.
The absolute scale is for Fahrenheit is Rankine and Kelvin per Celsius. But at minus 460, all molecular activity ceases. Everything quits that vibrating state.
Okay.
That's a solid, so the vibrating particles cannot move very far. In the liquid, they can move farther. In the gas, they can move farther.
Yeah, but there's still movement nevertheless.
There's still movement.
Yeah.
Well,
The only state that's uncontrolled is the next one after you got solid, liquid, and gas. The next state is called plasma.
Well,
Which everything comes apart again
I see.
in a disoriented manner, like
Okay.
it might have been at the start of this.
Okay, so that would, I wish you to be here, like maybe he could,
sit beside.
yeah. But this is the way I see it. I think it's perfectly logical. This is what I was really stressing. I think that God did it, the record shows us the perfect logic in which God started. He made space first. I mean, it takes a God to make space, right? And then he put all the building blocks from which he would make everything and form everything in more detail, and in more order. He made it all, but it was chaotic. It was unformed. It was unfilled. It was unrefined. It was just there, right? Then it says the next step, the Spirit of God began to apply energy. It was either the energy transferred either through sympathetic vibration, or simply through God just by His miraculous power, giving all the various forms to all the various parts of, not parts, but all the various molecules, within this chaotic state. And then it's fascinating that verse 3 is still talking about day 1, in my view, and it says the next level is that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. So God, when it says God said, who was he talking to? There was no people there, right? I think that for our understanding, this is helping us see that God was speaking it into existence. There was design. There was an idea in God's mind about what he wanted, and so he was, when it says God said, that he was actually designing it. This is what I want. I want the light to be. Okay? And then when it says, "and there was light," then that's an implication that he actually then went ahead and created it or made it. So we have a design, a design which is a pre-creation step in each one of these days. We see God saying, "Let there be light," and God saying, "Let there be a firmament," and God saying this and saying that. This is God, a reference to God designing it, and then he brings it into existence. So what he wanted then, within this mixed up plasma, with its energy systems latent within each molecule, the next step for him to refine and order his creation was then to make some of the light visible. And so at that point he either instituted the visible light spectrum within some of the planets. Not all the planets give light. There are stars that reflect light, but they're cold and they don't emit any light from themselves. This table doesn't emit light. It's not a light-emitting substance. But our sun is, right? And there are thousands or millions of suns throughout the universe.
Okay, so later on he says, "Let there be lights in the firmament for the heavens to divide the day, and the night let there be signs for seasons,
Right.
and for days and years." He talks about the lights in heaven, light upon the earth. Did later on he create the sun and the stars? Where did this light generate from?
Okay, this is an excellent question. In fact, I wrote Henry Morris one time and asked him that. I said, "Just a minute, it doesn't make sense to me. On day 1 it says God said, 'Let there be light,' and then in day 4 we come along and God is putting the sun and the moon and the stars into the heavens. That seems like a contradiction to me." And he said, "Well,
I catch
what
you up.
you didn't catch the question?
Yeah.
Day 1 it says God made light. Day 4,
Day 4.
God put the sun and the moon and the stars in the heavens.
Oh yeah.
Verse 16.
Yeah. Okay. And so his answer was a good answer. He says, in his view, God created the light emitting objects on day 1. But it wasn't until the 4th day that he put them in their respective orbits, their planetary interrelationships, all throughout the universe in relationship to the Earth. At this point, he simply created them. And it formed, somewhere in the universe, wherever God began to do his forming work, he created objects in space that emitted light, and differentiated between those and the objects in space that did not emit light. And so therefore you have light and darkness. Okay? And he had to sovereignly control this difference between day and night himself up until the planets were, it had to be a sovereign thing. That there was somehow he was turning things, up until the fourth day himself, until, to create a day and a night. Okay? And so his answer is that God light. I'm sure that there are even dust particles in a dirty room. You take a flashlight and you shine it on them. They're not light-emitting substances. They themselves are, if you take the light off, they're dark. You see? But if you shine a light on them, you see the dust particles in the air. Okay? And so the only light in that room would be the flashlight. Okay? And I think that's what God did at this point on day one, that he differentiated. He actually applied to some of the some of the matter, the ability to emit light. Okay? He just gathered all the gases together and made a Jupiter, and gathered all the gases together and made a sun, the Earth's sun, that sort of thing. But they weren't necessarily in their eventual ordered place. He just made them on day one, right? And so he designed light, and then he made light, and there was light. And then verse 4, God valued the light. He saw the light that it was good. He was pleased with the effect, right? What he did was good. Okay? And it says God divided the light from the darkness, and God then named the light day, and the darkness he called or named night. There was an evening and there was a morning, first day. Now, how could there be evening and morning? That, for us, looking at it after the fact, like we live after creation, right? For us, living after creation, evenings and mornings are because of the Earth's rotation around the sun. Okay? This is suggesting that there's only two possibilities. Either God himself somehow started and stopped the light through some other mechanism that we don't know of. Okay? There are any number of possibilities. Maybe he made all the matter pass through between these light-emitting substances on day one, and just block out the light from the other things, Or maybe he put a preliminary planetary orbit into existence on this day, and then refined it later on the fourth day. Okay, and there's no way to tell what he did, but there was a light in the day. But some of these questions we've never asked ourselves before. You see, it gets more complex when you start studying it. Okay, but God named it in verse 5. Okay, we come to verse 6. The next design element after creating light is let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. This word firmament in the Hebrew means just an expanse. It can refer to atmosphere, it can refer to space, right? It just means an expanse, an atmospheric expanse of some kind, undefined. But there's a reference to water up in verse 2, that God moved upon the face of the waters even before he made light. And as you guys were walking in here, we were just talking about the fact that water exists in a variety of states. In a frozen state, solid state, in a liquid state, and in a gaseous state. Okay, it doesn't tell us that it was necessarily in a liquid state in 1.3 or 1.2. It could have been all kinds of states, all mixed up. Probably was. It was probably, some of it was solid, some of it was liquid, some of it was gas. billions and billions and billions and billions of, square miles of water in gaseous state or in solid state or this or that. Okay, from this watery mixture in which matter was all mixed up, then God took out of that some matter and caused it to be light-emitting matter. And then his next step, after ordering that, was then to create a situation where you have a body of water separated from the rest of water by an atmosphere. Okay, this is obviously a reference to earth here, because the next verse goes on and shows what he was doing. And so his divine focus at this point was simply to begin to formulate this particular planet. This is the beginnings of the creation of planet Earth in verse 6. He separated water from water and put a space in between them. Okay? So the earth...
Just like there's moisture in the cloud, there's moisture in the air. If you cool this air enough, the moisture will come out.
Right.
Will fall out. So the moisture's here, even though we don't really feel it or see it right now.
Right.
And that's the division where the ocean is the water visible in a solid form.
Right.
And it's in our air.
Right.
That's the separation.
Okay. I would suggest that it's that what he's describing here as waters below, waters above, that the waters below and above were probably in the same or a very similar state, and that if there was any water in the intervening atmosphere, that, like you say, that it's invisible or whatever, it probably was, because what we have no way of knowing for sure what this was like, because our world is no longer like this. No longer is does the world have an atmosphere today which is bounded by water on the outside, because that was destroyed in the flood. When we come to chapter 7, verse 11, it says that the windows of heaven were open. It took 40 days for the water up there that was separated by this firmament from this planet proper. It took 40 days for that water to come and fall out of the skies through gravitational pull and come down and land on the surface of this planet. Okay? And so creationists generally refer to this as a water canopy. It was probably the same as the one below in state.
I see.
Okay?
Just when the astronaut space, they visit the planet and they try to find any living existence, like any virus. And first is they try to find any water. If there is any water, then there is a possibility to any living
life.
Life.
Yeah.
So symbolically, the water it represents the
Source of life.
Yeah, sequentially creation of the life.
That's right.
Without water.
Isn't it interesting that a child is bathed in water in its mother's womb before it's born? You know, that human life begins in water.
Water is also the H2O, so it's in the air is a lot of the qualities, the oxygen and the hydrogen.
Right.
Yeah, and nitrogen and everything else, yeah.
All right.
By percentage.
And so again, we have the divine design of the firmament, separating the waters. And then verse 7, it says he actually implemented the design. God made the firmament. Okay? He made it. He put it into effect. He actually did the division. So there was waters above and waters below. And then in verse 8, he named it. He called the firmament heaven. Now, this is where verse 8. Yeah, we have two heavens. And this is where you have to let Scripture, let the context define words. And this is a principle that we find all the way through Scripture. What does he mean by heaven here? It's obvious that the heaven he's referring to in verse 8 is not the same heaven he refers to in verse 1. Because in verse 1 there wasn't even a planet, the beginnings of a planet. There was just space. Space.
Also, there is several different heavens.
Right. And it could be that later on in the New Testament we have later revelation that kind of helps us to understand the current situation today, that the original heaven is perhaps a non-physical place. It's a spiritual thing. You want to call it fourth dimension, right? Where God himself is, who is a spirit. Okay? and then there was space that God made, the universe. And then on this planet, there's a heaven. This heaven that we see, in which the clouds are in out here, the atmosphere, right? And so that's obvious. The meaning of the word heaven in verse 8 is the earth's atmosphere between the lower waters and the upper waters. Okay, that space is called heaven now, right? But it's a different meaning than verse 1. We come to verses 9 to 13. We have the third day, and God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. So here's the divine design. God intended, on this particular planet, that on Earth, which we know became Earth, to then begin to refine further the interrelationships of the elements under the firmament, and so he said, okay, I want all the actual water to gather together in one place, and I want all the land to gather together in another place. It's interesting that the waters are plural and the land is singular. He doesn't call it continents here, he calls it earth, which is a suggestion. Here, this is just, I'm not being dogmatic, I'm just trying to help you see what I think it's saying. It says earth here, and that there were seas, plural. Okay? I think that the original earth was probably one supercontinent. And scientists today even believe that this is the way originally it was too. They called it Pangaea. It was earth that covered, it was all one. It was all one earth at one time. And in chapter 7, verse 11, it says the fountains of the deep were broken up. And I think that in the flood, later, after creation, right, that God destroyed the crust of the earth, of this land, see? And he allowed it to break apart in a huge cataclysm. You can imagine, what that must have been like for Noah to float around in his little boat, with these geysers shooting out of the bottom of the earth and volcanoes and everything else. Like, we can't even imagine what it must have been like. And it's interesting that if you take a world map and you look at the Far East, which is probably still the general area of where all of this stuff took place, where the Garden of Eden was, probably in that part of the world. It was unlikely that it was in North America or what did they say, Africa or someplace. It was more likely in the Middle East over there, somewhere around Iran. That part of the world is the largest mass still, and that the breakup, is on the extremities, you see. And so that's where Noah and his family survived, and ended up at the end. They weren't blown all over the whole world, so far as we know. And so it's, that was probably the safest place for him to float around in his boat. Whereas the real problems were down in the Mediterranean probably, and out in the Atlantic and out in the Pacific, where all these, where the tectonic plates of the earth were doing their grinding and breaking up and all that stuff.
And it also made space for the water too, huh?
Yeah.
As well.
That's right. What happens, you've probably all seen, I'm getting ahead of myself, it's hard to stay on track, but after a real hard rain, the raindrops will actually fall down and they'll splatter the dust, and then after a rainstorm you'll see big puddles and you'll see dirt floating together in little gobs, little tiny continents on top of the water. Okay. What happens if you take a stick or something and go click and you hit the little dust floater? It'll break apart and then it'll sink. Okay. Or if you were to take a gallon of water and go on top of that little smooth puddle where the dirt's floating on top, what happens? The water coming down from on top is going to break it, and then it's going to sink. And so what happened in the flood is pretty obvious, that not only was the rain building up, flooding on top of the surface of the earth and going up, if you wish, on the existing, the hills and the mountains and so forth, but these mountains themselves were probably, the crust of the earth was probably sinking at the same time, because it was broken up, and whatever forces were underneath the crust of the earth as originally created here on the third day, you see, there was, it was trying to find, the continent was trying to find an continents, now broken up in pieces, were finding an equilibrium this way. They were sinking, they were being pressed down with water, and so after a year's time they bounced back along with a lot of evaporation, you see, in the flood, and came to equilibrium. Okay, so that explains in a nutshell what was probably happening in the flood. And the original situation is implied here in verse 9 that, God gathered all the waters together, He gathered all the land together, He separated water from seas, and so the various, whatever the indentations of the shoreline of the original Pangaea continent, Earth was, you might call this a different body of water than this one over here, and so forth. You can see how you could have a variety of seas and yet one Earth.
Yeah, they probably perhaps they had more land back then. And then when all the water took more spot.
That's right. Most of the Earth is water today. Most of the
Yes.
surface of the Earth is on. But at that time, maybe it was the reverse. Okay?
I don't catch what Goulais is saying, but if we cut the earth and put the seed, then the water is over to the whole earth.
Right.
So the earth is pushed back.
It was sinking.
Yeah, sinking.
Yeah, so he was saying that today there's probably less land surface than there was in the original creation. Furthermore, we're suggesting that in the original creation, probably the land surface was all united.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Because the scientific
Yeah.
they explain. So that the earth is emerged, push
Yeah.
and come up the water.
Have you ever seen a map where somebody, you could probably do it yourself, get a world map and cut out the oceans and then put the continents together like a puzzle?
I saw that.
They fit together quite well.
It's
Oh, yeah.
the progressive.
So when it's split, this jagged edge here meets this jagged edge over here.
More or less.
More or less,
You have an Atlantic river instead of an Atlantic ocean. You can
Yeah.
see how it quite well fits.
Mhm.
And I've even read articles put out by Institute for Creation Research where they've actually gone to a point on the Atlantic coastline of Brazil,
Yeah.
and they've gone to a corresponding latitude to a point on the west coast of, let's say, Côte d'Ivoire in Africa, is it the
Cote
Ivory
d'Ivoire.
Coast?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And you look at the geological landforms and the structure, the strata. What is there geologically in the ground, they match.
Yeah.
And it
It's
shows
neat.
that
It's just
that
another-
originally they were together.
Another proof of
Right.
you're doing what God said to do.
Okay, now what is, again, we see logic here because all life needs water. Okay, all life needs water, but you can't have flowers and trees growing underwater. You have to have land, right? You can't have people without land, and so God was forming a situation where then life could live on this planet. First He divided land from the water, and then the next thing is He covered the land with vegetation. On the same day, verse 11, God planned it. He said, look, I want this earth to bring forth grass or vegetation, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. That's what I want. Creative act, and it was so. He brought it into pass. He designed it, and then He did it. Now let's look carefully at those words there for a minute. Let the earth bring forth grass. And he describes what this grass was going to be like. The herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. Now in the Hebrew, the word for vegetation or seed there is little tender shoots. That's what the word, it's describing that what God wanted at this point in creation is that He wanted the whole landmass to be covered with what looked like grass, with what looked like little tender shoots coming out of the soil. There were no trees. It was all shoots. Okay? But latent within the DNA and the chemical structure of each one of those shoots were the whole vast variety of flora and fauna, and as these things eventually matured in time, they developed into, some of it stayed grass, twitch grass, and some of it turned into water grass, and some of it turned into bulrushes, and some of it turned into pine trees and palm trees and deciduous trees, and the whole shooting match. But they all started out on the third day of creation as tender shoots growing out of the soil. But they had latent within them reproductive abilities. So this shoot would eventually mature and then produce seeds unique to its kind from which it would reproduce. And the tree would grow up and eventually mature and produce seeds, coconuts, from which it would propagate its species. Okay, so God put within, that's what it's saying here. God designed it so that all these immature shoots coming out of the ground would then eventually mature and be able to replicate. Okay? And so God did it. And it was so. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth vegetation, and her herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after its kind. He really stresses that it had within itself the ability to reproduce. But it was immature at this point. Now, this is why I ask you, this is why I think chapter 2 is necessary in the second account of creation. Because this was on the third day, and 2 days later, on the sixth day, God created man. Well, in 2 days, the grass might grow 3 inches, or 4 inches, or 6 inches if it's a tropical environment, right? I don't think man was a grass-eating creature like the cows and the sheep. I think he was vegetarian. I'll prove that, right, as originally created. But man needs more than grass to eat, right? And that's why in one particular location in the world, it says in chapter 2 that God made a garden eastward in Eden. In other words, as a special case for the highest creature, God created a perfect, mature environment where the grasses were not just seedlings and the trees weren't just shoots, but there was a fully mature garden with fruit trees already with the fruit on them in that garden. Now it doesn't tell us that in chapter 1, but in chapter 2 we have a complementary account of creation which later adds that in addition, on this same day, probably God did that to prepare a way for man that he was going to create within 2 days. Okay? That's how I see it. I see not 2 separate creations, but rather the second account is describing details that were necessary for life to exist in the first creation. And again, the divine estimation, verse 12, it was a good thing. God looked at it and he was satisfied with what he made. So that's the end of the third day. And the fourth day, verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light on the earth. We'll stop at that point. This is the divine design now. This is what I want, he says. I want there to be lights in the firmament of the heaven and to do certain things. Okay? And we know what he wanted eventually for this planet, verse 16, because he made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, that's obviously what?
The sun.
And the lesser light to rule the night, which is obviously, and he made the stars also. Tell me, are the sun, moon, and stars in this Earth's atmosphere? So they're not in the lower heaven, they're in the second heaven, or the outer heaven, the space heaven of chapter 1, verse 1, that God had made at the beginning of the first day. That was, in fact, the first thing God made was space, or the big heaven, right? And so what we're finding on the fourth day, as I understand it, is that in order for the plant life to stay alive, it needs a regular rotation of light. Light that comes in a short enough rotation to keep it alive. If this is the strongest argument, by the way, against the day ages theory, that the various days could not have been 1,000 or 5,000 or 50 million years, to account for evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because if God created the plant life all over the earth on the third day, and then it was 50 million years before the sun shined on them again, they'd all die. You see?
Without a motor.
You know, even if it was 5,000 years, or 1,000 years, or a year. You see, it's the strongest argument that we're talking about 24-hour days here. Okay? And so, God knew that the plant life that He had just created now needs regular light. All right, light, one kind of light by day, a different kind of light by night. I think even even the soil that nourishes the plants needs a rest on a regular rotation, right? Because if it was constantly growing 24 hours a day at a constant rate, you know, that it likely would be depleted or whatever.
Oh yeah, and you wouldn't have photosynthesis if you didn't have light and dark.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, where the plant produces oxygen,
Okay.
and where it takes in carbon dioxide.
Yeah,
There's
that
two,
happens, I think.
yeah, the two phases.
Oh, okay.
So your plant life supplies the world with oxygen in daylight,
In the daylight.
and it eats carbon dioxide in the dark.
Okay. Good. See, I that needed to be said because I.
Yeah.
What
Okay.
did you say?
Plant life supplies oxygen to the world in daylight. In darkness, the opposite, it takes carbon dioxide out of the air.
Mhm.
So the purpose for vegetation, I believe, is because of photosynthesis, is it provides an oxygen source and takes the carbon dioxide out in the dark.
So without darkness, we cannot survive our life.
That's
we
right.
need a balance.
So what God was doing is He was ordering the biosphere. Morris calls this the biosphere. I should use these terms because he says that on day one, on day two, God created the lithosphere. No, He created the atmosphere. And then on day three, when He separated the land from the water, He created the hydrosphere and the lithosphere. The water part of the planet and the rock part of the planet, the soil part of the planet. And then on the next day, He created the biosphere, right? All living organisms, plant life, on the land masses, okay? And probably including in the water, on the land mass under the water as well, okay?
There's one question. 14, let there be light in the firmament of the heaven. 15, in the firmament of the heaven.
Right.
And 16, okay, the 17, in the firmament of the heaven.
Right.
But this firmament of heaven is verse 6, the firmament in the midst of water. 7, the firmament, under the firmament, above the firmament. So firmament is stay between water.
Right. The Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah.
Right.
But they said let the light in the firmament.
Mhm.
But actually the moon and sun is outside of the
Right.
firmament.
So what I'm suggesting is that in those verses that you said, 14, 15, and 17, that when it refers to the firmament of the heaven, it's talking about the expanse of outer space. That in the expanse, which is the legitimate meaning of firmament, right, of heaven or space, God ordered the everlasting, this continued into the present, interrelationships of the planetary bodies within their various galaxies all through space. Okay.
Second heaven.
Yes,
Second-
in the second
Yeah,
heaven.
second heaven.
And
This
the
is the
light,
third.
the light-emitting bodies out in space, God designed them specifically for the benefit of planet Earth. Because He says that these lights in the expanse of space, outer space, would, number one, for the Earth divide day from night. So there was obviously, the Earth was being, maybe for the first time on the fourth day, not only were the planetary orbits placed, but then the rotation of the Earth was implemented. You see? Or maybe on day one, the Earth's rotation was implemented, and it wasn't until the fourth day that the orbits were implemented. That would probably be a better explanation.
I heard that the Earth is moved, and the solar system, the Earth belongs to solar, is moved, and also the clouds of there is a move.
Right? But according to chapter 2, in the original biological relationships, of plant life and animal life on the Earth, there was no the atmosphere that was originally created was different than the atmosphere after the flood. Because before the flood there was no hydrologic circle. It says that the Lord watered the earth from a mist that came out of the ground. And that was the only way in which the earth was nourished.
Oh, it came out of the ground.
Yeah.
I was
from mist
thinking there
from
was
the ground.
enough, I had a misconception, and I was thinking there was enough moisture in the air in the antediluvian
dew.
period where the canopy was. That,
It says, verse 6, there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground.
oh yeah, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I thought it was just in the air.
Yeah.
I thought there was enough moisture in the air somehow.
Yeah, I wish I
Really?
knew,
How to,
maybe Morris makes a comment on that, because that was his specialty. You know, his he's an actual scientist, and he was a hydrologist or something. Okay, but,
hydro, the word hydro meaning water.
yeah. Okay. So, but anyway, after the flood, then we have rain and clouds, you know.
Yeah,
the
our seasons and-
what do you call it, evaporation, distillation,
Yeah.
condensation, and there's another one, you know.
When it actually drops, I think.
Yeah. Okay? So on the fourth day, I think God actually put the planets in their orbits, and it specifically, as he says, he implies that he arranged the stars, both visible and invisible, probably the visible ones especially, in interrelationships. We would call them constellations. For signs, it says. Look at verse 14. And let them be for signs. Let these planetary bodies be for signs. I can't resist this. I've got to say this, okay? I read a book 2 years ago called The Real Meaning of the Zodiac. I think it's The Real Meaning of the Zodiac. And the guy wrote it as a preacher down in Florida named James Kennedy. He's got a television program all the time. He's a Presbyterian preacher. And he did some research, Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. And he did some research that proves from the legends of peoples around the world that the various names that have come down from antiquity in various cultures unite to argue that the various names of the various stars and the constellations have significant meanings that tell a story.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Pardon?
And the various stars
Okay.
in all of the constellations have names in all different cultures. Without it's impossible for people to have manipulated this. It comes back from creation. You see,
Like the largest star is called Epsilon,
or whatever.
and that word means something.
Yeah, but in different cultures, the cultures have given these different stars their own names. You know, and there's no way like how would they have gotten together to do this? It must have been original information that everybody knew that has disseminated down through the cultures. And he says that if you take the signs of the zodiac, they're divided into 12 houses, and each house has 3 or 4 constellations. And in each house, the 4 constellations, each one complements the other constellation to tell us something about Jesus Christ. Some of the houses describe the birth of Christ. Some of the houses describe the public ministry of Christ. Some of the houses describe the second coming of Christ.
And the houses is a house?
Not a literal house, but divisions of the sky. Call it a house. And some of the houses describe Christ's ultimate reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's fascinating.
Oh,
It is just fascinating. And I think that today, when you go through the grocery checkout counter, you know, you can find those little rolls, you know, scrolls of the stars, you know, the horoscope. That's a perversion of the original message. You see, the devil would have us believe that those planets determine our destiny. But in reality, it's the creator of those planets that determines our destiny. It's not the month that you were born that determines your destiny. Rather, it's the God who caused you to be born that determines your destiny. And that the signs of the zodiac, as misinterpreted today, are occultic. They're satanic and demonic. And that has come to us through Greek mythology. And the Greeks misunderstood the sky. And they turned it into a pantheon of different gods. there was Zeus and Apollos and this person and that person, and they made them all different gods, when in reality, the original intent of the stars, and God put them there for signs, to speak to us, to tell us a message. You see? And they were all, they all really tell us about Christ. One God.
That's neat.
Oh yeah, you got to
Never
read the
heard
book.
that.
You got to read the book. Jean Chester has it. Yeah, I ought to ask her for it. Yeah, the real meaning of the zodiac. And I couldn't let that pass, because I think, remember what David says in Psalm 19? The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament, space, shows his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech. Night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no voice nor language on the planet Earth where their voice is not heard. Anywhere on planet Earth, you look up and you see the message.
That's neat.
And people, ancient people probably knew more about the heavenly signs than we do today,
Yes.
because they were closer to it and less time had elapsed for the message to get skewed,
Yeah.
you know, and misinterpreted. And the devil had less time back then to deceive people with it.
Do
You
his
understand that?
handiwork, yeah. The
Yeah.
devil do his handiwork.
Yeah. Okay, and you go one step further. Romans chapter 1 verse 19 says that God is angry. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against the ungodliness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest among men, because by the things that are made, his eternal power and glory are manifest. Even his existence as a Godhead and his great power and glory, so that man is without excuse before God. There's enough in the stars to prove to us there is a God, that he's a plurality, that he has great power, he has intelligence, he has a design, he has a plan, and he has a program, and that people should bow and worship the God of the stars.
Not the stars.
Yeah, and that's the idea here. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 14, God placed on the fourth day not only the planets and their orbits, right, but also the constellations in the sky to tell us a message, for signs. You know,
I never noticed that before.
and for seasons, and for days, and for years. What do the heavenly signs tell us? That God would be born, that God's Son would be born, that he would grow up, that he would minister, that he would be put to death, that he would come back and reign as king. That's the story. There is a plan in progress in human time, from the day of creation, from the fourth day of creation. There is an evident plan, a chronological plan. Not only do the stars show in symbolic form that there is an overall plan, but the stars themselves also order the day by day, the season by season, the month by month, every other aspect of the human existence, right? We look at the night sky and we see the dipper there in such a, you know, in such and such a position, and we know what time of the year it is, you know.
And
It only
also-
happens like that during such and such a season.
And there is a general sign, fundamental, but also the subsidiary sign, like Jesus Christ born,
Right.
the light is shining.
Right? In fact, in this book, there's a couple of just phenomenal points that this guy made. He says there was a particular constellation that is only seen in the Far East at a certain time in human history, and it has subsequently disappeared. And it was a sign of a cross. It was a constellation that had the form of a cross, and it was only seen in the Far East, and it disappeared at the time of the birth of Christ. It was there throughout so many years of human history, and then the constellation disappeared. It's gone. You can't see it anymore from anywhere. And it very well could be that points to the Star of Bethlehem. You know, and he makes that suggestion.
And also the last days, the last day disasters, or the nature
Tribulation.
disaster, is related to the certain amount to show in the star, the signs.
Right.
Like
It says that the moon's going to turn to blood, stars are going to fall, you know, cosmic disturbances, and I think that and here's just a theory, but I think that the 15 or 20 or so different constellations in heaven that picture Satan. Oh, there's 2 or 3 serpents up there, and there's a scorpion, you know, and there's other ones. those constellations will likely be shot out of heaven. God's just going to go, you know. And there's actually, there's a scorpion. Oh, I can't remember. There's a scorpion up there that pictures Satan, and then right beside the scorpion is a figure that's pointing an arrow at the head of the scorpion, right? And it could be that during the tribulation, you know, at the second advent, the Lord's going to just go click, and he's going to trip something, and he's going to change the orbit, and all of a sudden the arrow's going to fly out of the hand of the, you know, that star is going to fly out of there and smash into the head of the scorpion. The scorpion constellation is going to disappear. You know, stuff like that. You know, I mean, it sounds far-fetched, but if you understand the stars as being placed in God for signs, that they really are a message from God to Earth inhabitants, you know, then it's, you know, when you put it all together, it's entirely plausible.
It's awesome. There's
Anyway.
so much we don't know, just about God's wonder.
We got to take about a 5-minute break.
Oriental,
We'll come back.
and also Mesopotamia. At least the Oriental, they predicted by searching the star changed with some other the different symptom in the sky, in the star, more shining or something.
Oh, yeah.
And they is predicted for the certain so like polity or the economy. It's related to our practical living. If they predicted it's very accurate in many cases. So then means in the heaven in star, it show or like our life is a kind of like predestined. Predestined. Even non-Christian society is related to the whole the earth is predestined the history, the future history. So they can catch a certain amount something will happen in there by searching of the signs of the stars in the universe in the heaven. So
I just read an article in a magazine that came from Friends of Israel, I think it was, and they said that the wise men that came to visit Jesus when he was a young boy, they've been traveling for a couple of years. And he says, number one, there weren't the three of them. There's no proof that they were kings. And they were called the Magi by Matthew. And that way, so he researched the word Magi, and he says these guys weren't Jews. I always thought they were Jews from the dispersion, from the Old Testament times when the Babylonians had taken the Jews away as captives. He says, no, they weren't Jews. They were Gentiles. They were as a class of people in several of the ancient cultures known as the Magi.
Magi means
They were sorcerers.
sorcerers.
Right? But astronomers and sorcerers were in the same group, and some of them, like he gives examples in the New Testament of Elymas the sorcerer, and there was another guy that Paul ran into that belonged to this caste, social caste, that people looked down on. Intelligent people looked down on these guys because they were like witch hunters and that kind of thing, you know, sorcerers and incantations and all that. But in the same caste, there were very many intelligent and very legitimate scientists. It was a scientist caste, really. And he says these people, you know, understood the true message of the stars.
Actually, Daniel is one of the wise men.
That's right.
It's like, you know, wise men and kind of sorcery or fortune teller.
He was in the same group as all the false guys.
Yeah.
Who?
Daniel.
Oh.
He was considered a wise man.
Oh, yeah.
You know, or an astrologer.
Oh,
or
I
whatever.
see. The general population put him in that category.
That's right. And that's why his life was on the line when the king got fed up with all these charlatans in his court that you know, they claimed to have divine ability to read dreams and stuff, you know, but when push came to shove, they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
They were charlatans, right? But Daniel, you know, did have a connection to the Lord, you know, so he did.
Oh, we need rest, you say?
5 minutes.